All right, and we are live yet again with Sunanda. Sunanda, thank you so much for joining us. You have one of the most powerful stories and just such an enormous amount of impact and wisdom. I couldn't be more honored and excited to have you here. Thank you.
I'm excited to be here, Sabrina.
It's going to be fun.
Yes,
I've been
yes.
telling people for weeks now about your story, and you've continued to blow my mind and, like I said, inspire and make me think differently. So for the few people who don't know you, you are a chief transformation officer of the federal customer success, right? At
Yes.
Dell Technologies. You're a mother. You have quite a story. You're an immigrant turned Harvard grad. So for those who don't know you, tell us a little bit about you.
Yeah, where I'm at right now is, I lead organizational transformations to scale and accelerate business impact and customer success, right? And I strongly believe that it's the culmination of all the experience that I had from right after college with being in customer success, then moving to product validation, then going to Harvard and getting my, business degree. And then program management and operational excellence, and finally in the office of the CTO. And I feel like I prepared myself for this org transformational role as I understood more about myself as well as the experience that I had in my 20 plus years journey. And it's the culmination of all that experience and personal growth that has landed me into this very exciting role. So, on the other end, you do refer to my background a little bit. And I think in some ways, the thread of transformation runs through my professional career, through my personal life as well. Yeah, I was the first female in my family back in India to go to engineering school. It was a little bit uncommon to send them out of the city and to a different place to go study engineering, not the norm at the time. And I was the first in my family ever to come to the US and go to grad school here for engineering and then later on to Harvard. So, as part of that journey, right, there were a lot of custom, norms that I had to break, some of them cultural, some of them, glass ceilings, where I went where I was the only woman in the room sometimes, or one of the few. And that made me very passionate about diversity. So I've been very active on the employee resource groups of every company that I've been on. And I do want to inspire I just do want to inspire and make sure that we leave a more diverse workplace and community for my daughter and her peers in the next generation, right? Just paying it backward, I guess. Or so that's my brief introduction.
And it doesn't even do justice. I mean, some of the things that we'll have to do a part two, because the stories that you've told me and sort of how you got here and all of those glass ceilings that you had to break and those norms and really how you went about it. And we'll unpack some of those today, but I mean, 20 minutes just isn't enough.
Yes,
You just are so powerful in
happy to do
the way
that.
you think and approach things. And one of my sort of hills to die on is DEI, or diversity and equity inclusion, isn't a nice to have. It really is necessary for business transformation. You really have to look at problems differently and solve for things differently. And that's why it's so important. And I think sometimes that can kind of get lost or forgotten, and you're the epitome of that, So I'm hoping we can kind of dive into that. So
yes,
going right in, you're Dell's Chief Transformation Officer for Federal Customer Success. You understand how transformation really relates in organizations, particularly with, in the federal space, and what that really means. So help us unpack, how are you and your team solving problems today? What are those kinds of transformations looking like?
right. First of all, it's a very proud moment for me. in some ways, I feel like I'm serving the country when I talk about the federal. That's the closest that I would ever get to giving back to this country that I now call my, I was born in India, but this is my second country. I'm a citizen here now. And so it's amazing to kind of, in some little ways contribute. So a lot of the federals, it's the same, but there is the extra element of security and compliance, which makes any regular problem more complex. But with my third role doing a transformation role, I think that there's some common themes, right? And it all starts with people. Are we building the right culture? Because when we build the right culture and we make sure that our teams are seen, heard, recognized, rewarded, they have a voice, right? That then, it doesn't matter what comes along the way, but you set up the right culture. And I can say that within about 12 to 18 months is what it takes to build that culture. And then you can throw any curveball and they, it's amazing how they come through. So the culture part is very, very critical in any new role that you go into. And it's like the common theme. It starts with people. It starts with building the teamwork. Communication is extremely important, but communication in a way that there's two pieces of it that I say: vulnerability. It's very hard to put yourself out there and be vulnerable, but that's really the key. That's when they connect with you, right? And once they connect with the leader, then you can take them through any journey, right? The second thing is almost always, I realize, is a well-defined but aligned strategy. So you can define the best strategy, but if your teams are not aligned with it, top down, sideways, I think that then execution, you won't see the results. So having a very well defined but aligned strategy is very key, so that you have a vision and a mission and how you're going to execute to that. And the third thing, you could have the best culture, you could have the best strategy, but execution. So that operational excellence, the program management frameworks, the processes, the best tools to do your job are very critical. So I feel like those are the three table stakes. It's setting up the right culture, it's having a well-defined aligned strategy, and flawless execution. Those are the table stakes.
And I could go on and on with questions and just horror stories. I mean, part of what Continuum does, and the reason why we were built in the first place, is because you had so many different silos across an organization that even internally you weren't aligned. So certainly externally, you were just create chaos and confusion and so much misalignment that you were missing, key and critical sort of pieces of that building and then execution. So I can see exactly, it almost has to go in that order: people, strategy, execution. And if you miss one of those pieces, I could see how it would impact the other components.
Right. It's like the strong core, right? Like when you exercise, and I like to give analogies, is you have a strong core, then you can kind of do some of the challenging stuff. But if you don't have the strong core, just built within your organization, then you're going to stumble as you take on additional challenges.
Yeah. We've talked in the past too about how you're really focused on taking sort of chaos and building into, organizing that chaos a little bit. How do you do that? Tell us how do you actionably or practically do that when you've got teams all over the world? You've got sort of legacy thinkers, you've got open-minded thinkers. How do you start to bridge that and bring that chaos more to organization?
Right. And a lot has to do with communication and collaboration. But, communication is one such thing. You never know whether it's getting received. And one of the things that I do very often is build feedback channels into the process and checkpoints, because what happens is usually you'll see strategy and then you don't see it at all up until it's time to evaluate how it's doing. and then you haven't taken continuous feedback, right? And I was on another panel, and it was an aha moment, because it's something I did that got validated. Is like, we don't ask the frontline, the people actually doing the job, like, why are we doing it, and what are the roadblocks that you have? And that's the intelligence that if we keep bringing into our feedback loop, then we have an opportunity to do course correction, because it's never going to be perfect, right? And you can't wait until, or you can't do the analysis paralysis. So I believe in, doing the due diligence and starting, and then adjusting through feedback, right? And then communication, and building the right communication plan, and the collaboration, right? And again, the culture plays an important role, because initially, you'll have, maybe you go into a new role, you have maybe 30-40% on board. Your first few attempts will get you to probably about 70-75%, and you really need to struggle with the rest. But once you have that inflection point with the majority, then you are good to go. But feedback, because most organizations will take feedback like once a year, or but I do believe that feedback just needs to be built into the fiber or the culture of the organization. And so doing open office hours, having a town hall, but taking quick surveys right after training. You do training and say, was this useful? Was this not? So it's also about efficiency. When you take feedback, it's like you haven't wasted too many cycles executing on something. And if it was not efficient or the best, then you course correct. But you're also sending a message to your people as well, and saying it's okay to do that. It's okay to try something, take feedback, do the due diligence, execute, take feedback, and get better. So we have to do and believe in more of the continuous improvement instead of trying to do a big bang.
Yeah. And it also, you just prove the point of why inclusion is so important. You said something really important about sort of getting away from this typical ivory tower that we've seen for decades before, where you've got folks at the top building the strategy. If you're not talking to boots on the street or at the field and ground level and understanding what are those real roadblocks that they're running into, either from an enablement perspective or their customers and clients perspective, what's getting in their way, again, you're stuck at an ivory tower. And by building in those feedback loops and really incorporating, giving them a voice and incorporating it into the strategy is the ultimate level of inclusion. That's the I of DEI. And by doing that, not only are you innovating, but you're building, sort of the backbone of that culture that you just spoke about. It's incredibly powerful. It seems so simple, but the impact of just that one thing that you mentioned is quite significant.
Yeah, there's wonderful things that come. I think that the most time that I usually spend is in the mentoring and coaching and the initial interviews in the new organization. Usually they'll tell you everything, in the first 30 months, and in the first 30 days, and they're just waiting to see what you do with it, right? And you got to make true on that when they're giving you feedback, make true on that and finish that feedback loop and saying, here's what we're going to try, or here's what we're going to do. And that makes it real. I've had people tell me, I have more cycles, I'm not being challenged, give me more. And that's when you've reached an inflection point, because they believe in the vision, they believe in your journey, they believe you'll take them through through success, right? But I think it gets harder as you go up, but I think it's also challenging to scale your time, but that's where you spend most of the time, is the one-on-ones, the feedbacks, to get those nuances, right? Because then you can kind of paint the picture and saying, okay, this is a broad theme that's running, and that's like, if we address that, maybe it'll address like half of the challenge. I don't know, whatever that balance is, right? What is the 20% that will address 80% or have 80% impact, kind of thing, right? Where do we spend the energy and the time?
And that's such a big piece of it. I could go on for hours about this. It's so incredibly important. And yet, we truncate these into 20 minutes. So I want to understand transformation from a personal side too, because that's something that I really consider you an expert. I mean, you've kind of seen, that's how we met really, is I've been on this fear forward crusade and doing things that scare me, and, learning publicly in a lot of ways about it, and sharing things that I normally and never have shared before. And when we first connected, you told me about some ways, and you hinted at it earlier, about how you broke some of those glass ceilings, and how you're the OG of fearing forward. You were constantly doing things that were pushing yourself and stretching yourself and changing maybe the norms or the rules at the time. So I want to get into that just a little bit and understand how do you do that? How do you take transformation into your personal life? And maybe how did you do that? Kind of
Yeah, I
across
think
your career?
it's actually the other way around, because I look at my journey back and I say, I have this very distinct story about when I landed here at UT Arlington in Texas for my grad, school. I had 2 weeks, no scholarship, was very determined to get some kind of scholarship, right? And I remember going 9 to 5 to every department on the campus and talking to any professor that was available, which weren't a lot because, it was still vacation. They hadn't opened school, but, I found a few. And I have to say, within 2 weeks, I ended up with a scholarship. And so I look at that and say, you know what? I always looked for different ways to solve a problem, and it's the grit and the determination too. Sometimes it's called desperation, desperate circumstances too, right? And this is what I say, some of the best things happen when you are desperate, but it's also the attitude that you have when you are in the situation. And so I feel like I've done that constantly in my career as well. Is and also it's the grit and the determination, but also not being afraid to try new things. The beautiful thing with that is, once you start tasting success a couple times, then you become even more bold. And so that's how the journey started. Is like the first job was 6 years, and the next job was 4 years, and the next job, then I was changing jobs and trying to broaden my skill set every 3-4 years, and it was almost always a brand new role, right? So I think it's kind of not addictive, but it's like a feedback loop. You do it a couple times and then you do it. And I think that's what happened, whether it was in my personal life and then doing that in career. But I think the brand, how did I want to be perceived, or what was my value prop, was actually a big question. I went to a branding class and I said, I already had made a determination, because at the time they emulated the people at the top, mostly men. I didn't want to do that, right? I was very fiercely independent. Yeah. And I said, I'm not going to emulate and anything. So what that did is, I was going to be vulnerable. I was going to be transparent, and I was going to take a chance, because when you're very transparent, it can be manipulated. And I was very aware, but I was willing to do that. And I can tell you, most often than not, it actually worked, because you create the connection with people. People know authenticity, people know vulnerability, right? And I have to tell you an example. Sometimes, a few years ago, I was going through, transformation is hard, right? There's weeks you feel like you're not making progress, and there are weeks. But what happens is, you're still a leader. And when people come and say, are you doing okay? Because I see how hard of a time it is, but I just wanted to let you know that you're doing the right things. I can see it change. It just hasn't changed enough. So in a lot of ways, when you are a leader, you think you are caring for other people, but it's amazing. You'll actually see people care for your journey too, as they are vested, right? And just so what is your brand gonna be? And it can never be anything other than authentic and vulnerability, because you do that, and it'll take time to stick sometimes, especially when you go in a very brand new role where people don't know you. But I still think that was very pivotal to success of the teams. I come next, but the teams, right?
Right. That's fascinating. I think for many reasons, when I first got into IT, I started with sort of the brand question. What do I really want to be? And what does that really look like? And, I reached out to a couple really trusted advisor, 5 or 6 of them. And I said, what are the first couple words that come to mind, 3, 4 words that come to mind when someone says Sabrina Shafer, and then I started to compile those words and look for overlap and figured, okay, that's my brand. Whether I like it or not, that's my brand. And a couple of years ago, I did it again just to kind of see, okay, all this time has passed. Where are we now? And it's incredibly impactful when you consider what's that message going out, because that's what establishes the credibility. That's what gets you through the hard times. That's what, builds a team that allows for trust and a safe place to try hard things and all that kind of stuff. So it's so much bigger than just a grandiose sort of, self-fulfilling brand. It really influences almost everything that you do and that your team does. And then it spirals into their own brand, at least if you have, people following you or really wanting to follow your leadership,
Yeah, that was very important to me. I wanted to make the leadership switch at a point where I felt very comfortable. So I was almost preparing for it for a long time before I took the role, and before a role that I wanted became available as well, the right fit, right? Because, I take the responsibility very seriously about having what we do for other people. And I just felt like I had to put in the time and the energy to have my own skills, understand a lot more about people, and work in different environments to have enough experience that when I stepped into the first role, that I was doing justice to it. I almost take it too seriously, but I feel like that's the passion I have for people, is like, you got to be ready for it when it comes to you, so you're doing right by the people.
So let me ask you this, and then I know we have to wrap. Like I said, we've got to do a part 2. This is so good. You've touched on so many things that I want to know more of, including, well, then if you didn't imitate other people, how did you do it? But we'll have to cover that, next time. So, you talked about how it almost becomes addictive to do things that kind of push you out of your comfort zone. And that's something that I've experienced and had no idea that was going to come my way. And it does kind of become fun, and you start to grow and learn from each other and build this network of people who are like-minded, maybe not exactly like you, but get that sort of, that's how you and I connected. We get that same amount of thrill out of executing really well, but also doing things a little bit differently, So, and these, these lives get a fairly good viewing, but what's interesting about it is you get senior leaders, and then you tend to get like boots on the ground, and it's a pretty even split. So knowing that, for those two sort of groups or audience, how would you recommend they work on or prepare to lead? Kind of looking back at what's worked for you, and if they're looking to maybe prepare to lead, if they're already leading teams or maybe want to be, do you have any recommendations or even, resources that you'd recommend they look at?
Yeah, there's one thing that I'll tell you that I lived through the role, but I'd read the book before, which was What Got You Here Won't Get You There. And that's the thing that you need to be so conscious about, because and you'll see this in organizations where people get rewarded with leadership roles for technical work they do, or things that didn't really align with leadership. And it's great, but having the mindset, knowing that what got you here it's not what's going to apply going forward here, right? And that's a very critical skill to know. The second is to have almost a board of mentors, because every season will be different in your career, and the challenges will be very different. And I have to say, because I took longer and I was more mindful, is I had people that felt so passionate about my success that when I moved from roles, especially to this role, they told me, they said, I'm going to meet you every quarter, and I'm going to make sure that you're just going to land strong. I know you will, but just want to be there for you. And I think that's what mentors can do for you, and sponsors, of course, right? Every level you go, you need to kind of understand, who are those people that can open the doors for you. And then the branding, like your brand should speak for you, whether you speak for 10 minutes, 5 minutes, and don't be afraid to speak up, right? Because you could do all the work, but if you're not representing, I feel a little bit more passionate about this because I see a lot of women who do phenomenal work, and then representing your work is almost as important as the work you do. Right. And I think those are the tips that I would give to everybody watching this.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, that's why we wrote The Art of the Subtle Brag, is how do you do that, either in conversation or in written communication? And, spoiler alert for those who haven't read the, article or been at a workshop, the art of the subtle brag is you're just saying, I did this, you could do it too, and we kind of broke it down into a 4-step, easy equation to make it really easy for people to start getting comfortable. But to your point, it can be incredibly stifling if you don't know how to communicate your wins and your successes. Yeah. And it's not just about you. The impact that it has to other people who hear, see, experience your wins is bigger than we can even dive into right now.
Yes, I'll leave on that one. We can leave with one note: is get from I to how I can serve others. And you can quickly get over that roadblock, because usually when we are presenting, leading, we think a lot about ourselves. But if you think about what you are here to offer others that they can benefit from, it gets very comfortable, because now you are thinking about what you have to offer, servant leadership. And then it gets to the point where you're excited about making it better for others.
Oh, you're so amazing. You are.
Thank you. I'm thrilled. I think, I'm so glad we connected, because I think we share the same energy.
Yeah, I agree. And I appreciate you talking about these things. It's scary to talk about these things, especially in cancel culture and all these different things. So the fact that you're willing to speak out and be such an advocate and so brilliant and such an inspiration. Thank you. I can't wait to see what's ahead for you. If people want to follow you, where can they find you?
LinkedIn. They can follow me, find me on LinkedIn. I do post quite a bit on exactly these experiences, as well as, what's going to take people to the next step. So happy to answer questions. Reach out to me. Thank you so much for having me. Happy holidays.
Happy holidays. Bye, everyone. See you soon.
Bye.
Bye.